They pitied her, whispered behind their lace fans that she was being sold to a man who would sooner look at his valet than his bride. Lady Clara knew the rumours about the Duke. She expected a cold marriage of convenience, a locked bedroom door, and a lonely life wandering the halls of a sprawling, empty estate. She braced herself for a lifelong arrangement devoid of passion. But when the heavy oak door clicked shut on their wedding night, what the Duke did next shattered every rumour and left her entirely undone. The study smelled of stale gin, damp wool, and impending ruin. Clara stood before her father's mahogany desk, her posture rigidly straight. Her ribs ached against the whalebone corset her mother's maid had laced too tightly that morning, but she did not let her discomfort show. Showing weakness in this room was akin to bleeding in shark-infested waters. Lord Ashford did not look up from his ledger. He simply scratched his quill against the parchment, crossing out another line of credit he had long since exhausted. "The Duke of Windermere," her father said, his voice a dry rasp. "He has agreed to the settlement. Your debts, our debts, will be cleared by the end of the quarter." Clara stared at the bald spot on the crown of her father's head. "Windermere," she repeated. The name tasted like ash. Yes. He finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them sagging with the weight of decades spent at the faro tables. "The papers are signed. You will marry him by the end of the month." She didn't cry. She had stopped crying over her father's gambling at the age of 14. Romance, she had learned early on, was a lie sold in cheap penny dreadfuls to keep stupid girls compliant. Marriage was commerce. She was a commodity. Her dowry was non-existent, but she possessed an old aristocratic name and a face that was deemed conventionally pleasing. It was enough to buy her family's salvation. "I understand," she said evenly. Her father blinked, perhaps surprised by her lack of hysterics. "You know the talk, I presume. The society whispers. I am aware of the rumours regarding the Duke's preferences, yes," Ashford scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Gossip. Nonsense meant to sell society papers. But even if it is true, it works to your advantage. You will have his title, his wealth, and his country estates. He will demand very little of you in return. Produce an heir, somehow, and you will be left to your own devices. It is a brilliant arrangement. A brilliant arrangement." Clara turned and walked out of the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. She leaned against the hallway wall, closing her eyes. Theodore Fitzroy, the Duke of Windermere. He was 10 years her senior, notoriously reclusive, and the subject of London's most vicious drawing-room gossip. He had spent his 20s in Italy, returning only when his elder brother died in a riding accident. Since taking the title, he had attended the requisite societal functions, but remained entirely aloof. He danced with no one. He courted no one. He was frequently seen in the company of a close circle of bachelor friends, a fact the Ton seized upon with ravenous delight. They said he hated women. They said he was unnatural. Clara didn't care. If he preferred men, it meant he wouldn't force himself upon her in drunken, fumbling, late-night visits, the way she had seen her father do with her mother. A polite, distant roommate who paid her bills was more than she had hoped for. She met him 3 days later at a stifling assembly in Mayfair. The room was a suffocating crush of silk, sweat, and overpowering floral perfumes. Clara stood near a potted fern, sipping lukewarm lemonade, waiting. "He's coming," her mother hissed, gripping Clara's elbow tight enough to bruise. "Smile, for God's sake. Look agreeable." Clara pasted on a flat, practiced smile. She watched him approach through the crowd. Theodore Fitzroy did not look like the flamboyant, delicate aesthete the gossip rags painted him to be. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a severely cut coat of dark navy wool. He wore no ostentatious jewelry, no intricate cravat folds. His face was sharp angular and deeply tired. His dark hair was brushed back, threading with early silver at the temples. He stopped before them. He bowed perfectly. Lady Ashford, Lady Clara. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges, like he didn't use it often. Your Grace, Clara said, dipping into a flawless curtsy. Would you care to walk? He asked, not looking at her mother, focusing entirely on Clara. His eyes were a startling, pale grey. Cold, she thought. Like winter ice. I would be delighted. She placed her gloved hand on his forearm. Underneath the fine wool, his arm was solid, tense. They walked away from the glaring eyes of her mother and the hushed, buzzing whispers of the surrounding crowd. The parting sea of aristocrats watched them with undisguised fascination, the ruined lord's daughter and the sodomite duke. What a pair! They reached the edge of the terrace. The cool night air hit Clara's face, a blessed relief. I detest these things, Theodore said suddenly. He didn't look at her. He was staring out into the dark garden. The feeling is mutual, Your Grace, Clara replied. He glanced at her, a faint crease appearing between his brows. You do not need to flatter me, Lady Clara. I am well aware of the nature of our arrangement. Your father was entirely transparent regarding your family's financial constraints. And what of your constraints, Your Grace? Clara asked. She was tired. She had no energy for coy society games. Why marry me? Surely there are wealthier, more influential families willing to turn a blind eye to the gossip in exchange for a ducal coronet. He turned fully to face her. The pale grey eyes studied her face with a strange, clinical intensity. You do not talk much. You do not simper. And when you look at me, you do not look at me with either fear or disgust. You look at me with absolute indifference. Clara held his gaze. Is that what you want? Indifference? I want peace, Theodore said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I want the society mothers to stop parading their daughters in front of me. I want the House of Lords to stop questioning my stability. I need a duchess to manage my estates and anchor my household. And I need someone who will not expect a grand romance. You are in luck, Your Grace, Clara said, her voice dry. I left my romantic delusions in the nursery. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift happened in his expression. It wasn't a smile, but the tension in his jaw relaxed. We understand each other then, perfectly. The engagement lasted 3 weeks. It was a whirlwind of humiliating extravagance paid for by Theodore's solicitors. Clara was measured, pinned, and draped in silks, muslins, and velvets. The gossip was relentless. Clara sat in the parlour of Lady Clementine's townhouse, balancing a porcelain teacup on her knee. The other women in the room were circling her like vultures smelling blood on the wind. It is such a sudden match, Clara dear, Clementine purred, adjusting the lace on her sleeves. We were all quite shocked. The Duke of Windermere is so particular. He is a man of decisive action, Clara lied smoothly, taking a sip of the bitter tea. Decisive, yes. Another woman, a Viscountess, tittered behind her fan. Though one wonders where his decisions usually lead him. I hear he spends an inordinate amount of time at his club, exclusively in the billiards room. With Lord Weston, the implication hung in the air, heavy and crude. Clara felt a sudden, inexplicable flash of irritation. Not because they were insulting her future husband, but because of their smug, sheltered cruelty. They sat in houses paid for by men who kept mistresses in Covent Garden and beat their wives behind closed doors, yet they felt superior because Theodore's alleged sins offended their delicate sensibilities. Lord Weston is a renowned scholar of antiquities, Clara said, her voice dropping a register, cold and flat. I believe the Duke shares his interest in Roman architecture, But if you prefer to imagine them doing something more scandalous beneath the billiards table, Clementine, please do not let me interrupt your fantasies." The room went dead silent. Clementine's face flushed an ugly mottled red. Clara set her teacup down with a sharp clink. "Thank you for the tea. I really must be going. My fittings." She walked out of the townhouse, her chest tight. She didn't know why she had defended him. Pride, she told herself. Defending him was defending her own choice, even if the choice had been made for her. When she returned to her family's meager rented house, she found a package waiting for her in the drawing room. No flowers, no poetry. It was a heavy, rectangular parcel wrapped in brown paper. She opened it. It was a first-edition translation of Homer's Odyssey, bound in dark green leather. A note was tucked inside the front cover. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and precise. "You mentioned on Tuesday that your father sold your library. A house should not be without books." Clara stared at the heavy book. She ran her fingers over the gold leaf lettering. Tuesday. 4 days ago. They had sat in a stilted silence in her mother's parlour for his mandatory courting visit. She had merely made a passing comment about missing the smell of old paper. He had been looking out the window. She hadn't thought he was even listening. A strange ache bloomed in her chest. She pushed it down immediately. It was just a book, a wealthy man throwing a few coins at a problem. It meant nothing. Still, when he arrived the next evening to escort her to the theatre, she thanked him. They sat in the shadowed box, watching the actors on the stage below. The theatre was hot, and Clara felt the whalebone of her evening gown digging viciously into her ribs. She shifted, trying to draw a full breath, wincing slightly. "Are you unwell?" Theodore asked quietly, not looking away from the stage. "I am perfectly fine," Clara lied. He finally turned to look at her. His pale eyes scanned her rigid posture, the slight pallor of her face. "You are not breathing. It is the fashion to not breathe, Your Grace. It proves one is a lady." He didn't laugh. He frowned, a deep scowl settling over his features. "It is barbaric. You look as though you are in pain." "It is nothing. It is not nothing if it hurts you." He shifted closer. The scent of him, sandalwood, clean linen, and cold rain, washed over her. He reached out. Clara stiffened, expecting him to touch her arm. Instead, he reached behind her back. His large, warm hand rested briefly against the rigid lacing of her gown. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice dropping so low the bustling crowd below couldn't possibly hear. "Tell the modista to loosen the stays by 2 inches. If she refuses, tell her I will find a new seamstress." Clara stared at him. "The gowns will not fit correctly. Society will say I look sloppy." "Let them say what they will," Theodore replied, turning his gaze back to the stage. "I am already the sodomite duke. They can call you the sloppy duchess. We shall be a menace to polite society together." Clara let out a short, startled sound. A laugh. It bubbled up from her chest before she could stop it. Theodore glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a fleeting, phantom smile. It transformed his harsh face entirely, making him look devastatingly human for a fraction of a second. Then it was gone, hidden back behind the mask of aristocratic boredom. But Clara remembered it, and for the rest of the week, the whispers of society felt a little less loud. The wedding day dawned grey, cold, and utterly unremarkable. There was no grand cathedral, no hundreds of guests. Clara's father had insisted on a small, private ceremony, claiming it was more elegant. Clara knew the truth. He couldn't afford a large breakfast, and Theodore had zero interest in making a spectacle of himself. She stood in the draughty stone vestry of St. George's, shivering in her white silk gown. Her mother fussed with her veil, her hands trembling. "Now, Clara," her mother began, her voice pitching high with nervous energy. Tonight will be—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Well, you know the rumors. Perhaps nothing will happen. If he does not come to your room, you mustn't feel slighted. It is a blessing, really. Men are beasts. If he leaves you be, simply go to sleep." Clara looked at her mother's tired, lined face. "I know, Mother. I do not expect anything." The ceremony passed in a blur of archaic Latin and echoing footsteps. Theodore stood beside her, a pillar of dark broadcloth. He smelled faintly of brandy. Nervousness, Clara wondered, or liquid courage to get through the binding of his life to a woman. When he took her hand to slide the heavy gold band onto her finger, his skin was ice cold. His grip was entirely firm, but he did not meet her eyes. "I, Theodore, take thee, Clara." His voice was steady, a contract being read, a deal being struck. They left the church and immediately boarded the heavy travelling carriage adorned with the Windermere crest. They were bound for Ironwood Hall, his ancestral seat in Yorkshire. It would be a brutal, 4-day journey. The carriage door slammed shut. The horses lurched forward. Silence descended. Clara looked out the window as the cobblestones of London gave way to the muddy, rutted roads of the countryside. Rain began to spit against the glass, blurring the world outside into smears of grey and green. Hours passed. The silence in the carriage was thick, almost suffocating. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, watching the raindrops race down the pane. "You are shivering." Theodore's voice broke the quiet like a gunshot. Clara started, turning to look at him. He was sitting in the opposite corner, a heavy wool blanket draped over his knees. "It is just the damp," Clara said. He didn't argue. He simply picked up the edge of his blanket and held it out toward her. Clara hesitated. Sharing a blanket felt entirely too intimate for two people who had essentially purchased each other. But the cold was seeping into her bones. She slid across the leather bench, keeping a foot of space between them, and tucked the heavy wool over her legs. "Thank you," she murmured. "Ironwood is draughty," Theodore said, staring at the brass handle of the carriage door. "It was built for defense, not comfort. The walls are thick. The fires never seem to heat the rooms fully. You will need warmer clothes than those London silks." "I am adaptable, Your Grace." "Theodore," he corrected softly. "If we are to live in the same house for the rest of our lives, you should probably use my name." "Theodore," she tested it. It felt heavy on her tongue. "Then you must call me Clara." He nodded once. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the squabs. "The estate is isolated, Clara. There are no neighbours for 10 miles. The servants are quiet. It is a lonely place." "I am used to being alone," Clara said. He opened one eye, looking at her in the dim light of the carriage. Being lonely in a crowded room in London is different from being lonely in a stone fortress in the middle of the moors. "I will not keep you prisoner. If you wish to return to town for the season, you may. I will fund it." Clara looked down at her hands. He was offering her an escape, a way out of his life. It was a generous, decent thing to do. So why did it make her chest feel tight? "I have no desire to return to London," she said truthfully. "I'm quite finished with society." Theodore let out a long, slow breath. "Good. Because society is a disease." They did not speak again for the rest of the day. They arrived at Ironwood Hall 3 days later, just as the sun was setting behind the jagged peaks of the moors. The house was monstrous. Dark, brooding stone rising up from the earth like a natural cliff face. Tall, narrow windows stared out over the desolate landscape like empty eyes. It was intimidating. It was terrifying. Clara thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The staff was lined up in the massive entrance hall. They were exactly as Theodore had described, quiet, older and fiercely loyal. They looked at Clara not with the disdain she expected, but with a cautious, hopeful curiosity. "Show the Duchess to her rooms," Theodore instructed a stern-faced housekeeper named Mrs. Gable. "Have a hot bath drawn. She is exhausted." He didn't look at Clara. "I will be in my study." "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Theodore." Clara followed the housekeeper up the grand, sweeping staircase. Her rooms were vast, decorated in rich burgundies and heavy oak. A fire was already roaring in the hearth, chasing away the worst of the chill. A maid unlaced her travel gown, finally freeing Clara's ribs. She bathed in hot water scented with lavender, her mind entirely blank. The exhaustion of the journey and the monumental shift in her life were finally catching up to her. She put on a simple white cotton nightgown. It was practical, high-necked, and entirely unseductive. It didn't matter. Her mother had said it. "If he leaves you be, simply go to sleep." She sat on the edge of the massive four-poster bed. The house was silent. A heavy, tomb-like silence. She looked at the door that connected her suite to the Duke's. It was made of thick, dark wood. It was closed. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She was safe. She was alone. She was the Duchess of Windermere, and her life would be quiet, undisturbed, and entirely her own. She pulled the covers back. "Knock, knock!" Clara froze. The sound came from the connecting door. It wasn't loud, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like thunder. She stared at the wood, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "Knock, Clara." His voice was muffled through the heavy oak. Low, hesitant, Clara stood up, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. She walked slowly toward the door, her pulse roaring in her ears. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and turned the brass handle. The heavy oak door swung inward with a faint, metallic click. Theodore stood in the threshold. He had discarded his formal coat and his cravat. He wore only a white linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and dark trousers. The stark light of the single candle in his hand cast long, flickering shadows across the harsh angles of his face. He looked entirely different. Stripped of his aristocratic armor, he was just a man. A very large, terrifyingly quiet man. Clara clutched the collar of her cotton nightgown. Her heart battered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "May I come in?" he asked. His voice was a low, rough scrape in the quiet room. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat. Yes. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He set the candlestick on a nearby table, then turned to face her. He did not move toward the bed. He did not move toward her. He simply stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking at the floorboards between them. "My mother told me," Clara started, her voice sounding entirely too thin. She cleared her throat and tried again. "My mother told me that if you didn't come to my room, I should just go to sleep. She said it would be a blessing." Theodore's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked beneath his skin. "Your mother is a fool, but she was right to assume you would prefer a locked door. I did not lock it." He looked up. The pale grey of his eyes caught the firelight, burning with a sudden, startling intensity. "Why?" "Because you are my husband," Clara said, forcing the words out. She refused to tremble. She would not be a cowering victim. "And because we made a bargain. My father's debts are paid. I am yours to use as you require to secure the line. I know what is expected of me." Theodore flinched. It was a minuscule movement, a sudden tightening of his shoulders, but Clara caught it. He took a step forward. "Is that what you think this is? A transaction? You think I came in here to use you?" Clara held her ground, though her instinct screamed at her to step back. "I think you are a duke. Dukes require heirs. I am not stupid, Theodore. Do what you must. I will not fight you." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, Theodore let out a breath that sounded like a ragged curse. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Clara braced herself, shutting her eyes, waiting for the rough hands, the tearing of fabric, the crude, fumbling weight she had been taught to expect from men. Instead, she felt a sudden warmth radiating against her face. She opened her eyes. Theodore was standing inches away, his hands hovering on either side of her jaw, not quite touching her. His chest rose and fell in harsh, uneven breaths. "Look at me," he whispered. Clara looked. "The rumors in London," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "They say I despise women. They say I prefer the company of men in dark, hidden rooms. They say I am cold, unnatural, and devoid of feeling. I know what they say. They are half right." He finally let his hands rest against her cheeks. His palms were rough, calloused from riding, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "I am unnatural, because I look at the men in my circle. Men like your father, men who take mistresses, who treat their wives like breeding mares, who take whatever they want by force, and I feel nothing but violent disgust." Clara's breath hitched. "I let the rumors spread," Theodore confessed, his thumbs lightly tracing the line of her jaw. "It was the easiest way to keep society's vultures away from me. If they thought I was a sodomite, the matchmaking mothers stopped throwing their daughters in my path. It gave me peace. It kept the world at a distance. But it was a lie." He stepped closer, his body radiating heat through the thin cotton of her gown. "I do not despise women, Clara. I despised the women they tried to sell me. I despised the simpering, the falseness, the greed." He leaned down, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "And then I saw you, standing in that corner, looking at the entire room as if you wanted to burn it to the ground." Clara's lips parted. A tiny gasp escaped her. "I am not going to use you," Theodore whispered, his lips brushing against hers with every word. "I am not going to climb on top of you in the dark, take what I want, and leave you crying into your pillow. If I touch you, it is because you ask me to. If I stay in this room, it is because you want me here. If you tell me to walk back through that door, I will go, and I will never cross the threshold again." He pulled back, just enough to look into her eyes. The coldness was entirely gone from his gaze. It was replaced by something raw, hungry, and dangerously vulnerable. "The choice is yours, Clara. Tell me to leave." Clara stared at him. The man society called a monster. The man who had bought her. He was offering her the one thing she had been denied her entire life: absolute control over her own body. The shock of it hit her like a physical blow. The icy shell she had built around her heart cracked, splintering down the center. She didn't speak. She didn't know how to. Instead, she reached up, her trembling fingers wrapping into the soft linen of his shirt. She pulled him down. When his mouth covered hers, there was no brutality. There was a desperate, shattering reverence. Theodore groaned, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He kissed her like a man starving, like someone who had spent his entire life in the freezing dark and had finally found the sun. He didn't rush. He stripped away her practical, heavy nightgown as if it were spun glass. When he lifted her onto the massive 4-poster bed, he followed her down, sinking into the mattress. "Tell me," he murmured against her neck, his breath searing her skin. "Tell me if I hurt you. Tell me to stop." "Don't stop," she breathed, her hands tangling in his dark, silver-threaded hair. "Please." The consummation of their marriage was not a transaction. It was a baptism. He mapped every inch of her with his hands and his mouth, unearthing nerve endings she didn't know existed. He worshipped her. He dismantled her defenses piece by piece, drawing